Welcome everyone to our May Family Law Community of Practice. I'm here being supported by two of our NIWAP team. I'm Leslie Orloff. I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University, Washington College of Law. And I have with me Nupur. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nupur Chandna, and I'm a policy fellow here at NIWAP.
And Abby?
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm an intern here at NIWAP.
So they're going to be assisting me today with this presentation. And today we're going to talk about civil protection orders for victims of human trafficking. And as we get started, first of all, we want to thank, as always, OVW for their support for this program. But what the views you're going to hear today are mine and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Office on Violence Against Women. As often as we do all the time on our communities of practice, the slides we're providing you will be available on the community of practice, Family Law Community of Practice link, and they'll provide more detail than I'm going to cover in detail today, but also contain links and information that you'll find useful on the topic. So as we get started, I know many of you are familiar with protection orders, but I wanted to talk, this project that the work that we did to create these tools took about 3 years. We went through all of the protection order statutes in the country that we could find for anything and tried to analyze them and see under which circumstances they'd be available to victims of human trafficking. And we were focusing on protection orders because, as you all know, protection orders are a legal remedy that the victim can control. The victim who's a victim of violence or threats or harassment, sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, can control in the civil justice system, independent of whether or not there's a criminal case. Protection orders are temporary or permanent and issued in response to a complaint filed by the victim. And in some states, there are protection orders available in criminal cases as well as civil cases. But we really wanted to look at the option to see how it could be useful to adults and children, victims of both labor and sex trafficking, because we believe that they are an underused remedy that we wanted to encourage more of you to think about using with the human trafficking victims that you work with. So to get started, and maybe you could type in the chat or unmute and share, how might protection orders benefit victims of labor trafficking or sex trafficking? Any of you want to share your experiences or what you think why they might be particularly useful? Anybody? Any ideas? Might help them leave their trafficker. Exactly. And actually, one of the things, while I'm giving you a second to respond, we did a piece of research from 2006, comparing 2016 to 2017, because we wanted to understand the extent to which victims would or wouldn't use protection orders in times of increased immigration enforcement. And what we found was that although many victims were afraid to file immigration cases back then, with the help of advocates and attorneys, we're talking about domestic violence victims, continued to use protection orders at high levels, particularly in courts that were providing qualified interpreters, were signing SIJS findings and doing U-Visa certifications. So they talk about preventing. You're suggesting that they prevent future and ongoing harassment by the trafficker, criminalizing contact that would, for a quick response, absolutely. That once you get the protection order, if you call the police for help, the victim calls the police for help in the future, the chances of getting a better police response to future incidents is much greater because there's now a protection order violation. And it gives them an avenue. When you say, Tanya suggesting it gives them an avenue to change their status, it gives them documentation of the abuse that could be useful in a T visa case, a U visa case, a VAWA self-petition, or for, if it's a domestic violence case, VAWA cancellation of removal, for example. So all of those are absolutely true. And it also is a remedy that the victim can control and that they can, let me see, anything else? We got most of these. The other thing is it may be crafted, you can craft the remedies to be very particular to that specific victim and to the power and control techniques or methods that that particular trafficker is using. So they're very helpful in that respect. So how many of you have worked with victims applying for protection orders, just generally, all victims? I'm assuming most of you have, but let's just get a picture. I always like asking these questions because I get a sip of tea in between. Okay. So about 75% of you responded, and it looks like 96% of you have worked with victims applying for protection orders, and a few of you are more new to this. Great. Just want to know who my audience is. So I want to talk right now about the tools that we've created for you. Got a QR code here. We're going to demo these for you in a moment. So you don't have to go to the site right now. We're going to show you what it looks like. And you'll have these for future reference. So the first tool is we have a state laws on protection orders for victims of trafficking. And this summarizes what's offered by state and highlights the types, because the big issue is protection orders, who can get them varies. Some have relationship requirements and some don't. The domestic violence ones typically have the relationship requirements. Stalking and sexual assault typically don't, or stalking, harassment, and sexual assault are less likely to have relationship requirements. Almost all protection orders are open to adults. There are some states that limit which children can get protection orders. And then we look at under what conditions, based on the protection order, a labor or sex trafficking victim may be able to get it. And then the next, so with 3 tools, that's one of them. The next one is, so that was that's like a chart where there's like, sorry, going back and forth. There are boxes, like you can see by state, you'll see the check boxes. Then we have a table, oh God, hold on. Okay, then we have a table, which is all of, we basically have the language of all of the state laws, and we've analyzed them by state with a summary up top, so you can quickly see how a trafficking victim would use each of the types of protection orders available in that state. It has a summary, and then it also we had to address limitations for children, and then we have a comparison chart. I think I might have mixed these up, but anyway, there's a third chart, a third tool where you can get a big overview nationally of what's happening in other states, so you can see trends. So we broke it out in 3 different ways. So Nupur, I'm going to let you do a better job than I just did by your screen and showing them what they look like.
No, it's just going to be more easier once the visuals are up for everyone.
Okay, so this is the one where you can compare. Can you make it one notch, like Control plus, one little bigger? There we go.
Is this better?
Yeah. So what this does is a check means that state has that type of protection order. And when there's a letter code in the state, it means, so for example, in Alaska, if you're a victim of dating violence, then you need to use the domestic violence protection order of that state. Or if you're a victim of elder abuse, you have three choices. You can go to the domestic violence protection order, the
Stalking.
stalking protection order, or sexual assault protection order. And so it summarizes it so you can see how you get which kind of protection order based on the kind of abuse, the type of order, and which type of order is available in which state. It's really easy in this to see what your neighboring states are doing. This is like the easiest way to see that. And on the additional grounds, can you go down a little bit more? The additional grounds, this is good, have particularly, basically draw note to where there are particular issues that may be different for children in states, so that where protection orders aren't fully available to children. Okay, so now let's go to the big tables. Okay, so this is an example of the big tables. For every state, we have this for all 56 jurisdictions, I believe, right? We got the territories in
Yes,
here?
we have the territories as well.
Okay, so for each state, it starts off with a summary of the types of protection orders available in that state. It discusses whether there's a, whoops.
Sorry, it moved from
Oh,
here.
okay, stop.
We're back.
It discusses where there's a relationship requirement, and then it summarizes how trafficking victims may in that state be able to get that order. So in Iowa, victims of sex or labor trafficking can get 3 types of protection orders if they meet the eligibility requirement. There's no relationship requirement for sexual assault and elder abuse protection orders, making these the least restrictive for trafficking victims. And then you have the offenses covered from the statute. You have all of the relationship requirements from the statute. And the column to the right is a summary of labor and sex trafficking victims, when and what they can get. And it also includes where there's a child restriction. So for example, in Iowa, you can, if you're a child, you can get a protection order against your dating violence partner, but not your father, right? That, or not
Yes.
a family member living in, blood or marriage family member living in the same household. So those particular restrictions, and we have these included because there's lots of child labor trafficking victims and child sex trafficking victims that will have a little bit less access in some states to protection orders than adult victims. Can you go down a little bit? So here you see we went through the domestic violence protection order statute for Iowa, then we go to the sexual abuse protective orders, keep going. And we do that for each one with the language, and then the elder abuse protection orders. That's great. And so that's what this chart looks like. And then the last tool we have for you is, it's basically a comparison of the state laws where we're going through, it's a publication where you can see them grouped differently. So you want to go down to that?
Yes, I'll take you.
There we go. So for trafficking, we start by identifying the 7 states that have specialized protection orders for trafficking victims, and then we discuss the 2 states where they're available for sex trafficking victims only. And then we go through, like, this is a way you can see all of the states that have to use the domestic violence protection order or can use. And then you go down a little bit further and you'll see for sex trafficking victims use of, and we compare labor and sex for both, so that because sex trafficking victims in many states will have more access to protection orders than labor trafficking victims. And so this allows you to kind of see, to go to look particularly, they almost never cover labor. There's no state that covers labor only, but there's some states that only cover sex trafficking. And then we're summarizing the states where human trafficking victims have to go through their stalking statutes, or they have to go through sexual assault protection order statutes or harassment statutes. And then sometimes we also summarize the other versions are the workplace protection orders, elder abuse, and extreme risk. And then there's some specific child abuse and dating violence ones as well. And that's how this document works. Thank you, Nupur. We can go back to the presentation. Okay. So now I'm going to talk to you about, give you a little bit more detail about these charts and what we found when we looked at this. So there are, basically two major eligibility requirements that become important for trafficking victims in terms of whether or not the domestic violence, what kind of protection order they can seek. So there's a crime type and the relationship. The type of crimes, these are all the different kinds of protection orders we looked at, the different kinds of crimes that they cover. Obviously, we know that the domestic violence protection order covers many of those other crimes listed below that are occurring in family and other relationships that are covered by the domestic violence statute. But there's also protection orders specifically for sexual assault, for stalking, for human trafficking, harassment, etc. The relationship requirement, we analyze like which of the protection orders generally have relationship requirement, and generally any human trafficking specific protection orders have no relationship requirements, with some exceptions. Stalking protection orders generally have no relationship requirements. Same thing with harassment and anti-harassment and anti-sexual assault protection orders. All of the workplace violence ones don't have any relationship requirements. All of the child abuse ones don't have relationship requirements. Elder abuse sometimes do and sometimes don't. They mostly don't. And the most common ones that have relationship requirements are the domestic violence, dating violence, and extreme risk gun violence protection orders. So have you helped victims, which of you, in terms of the second poll is, have you helped victims obtain the following types of protection orders? So it'll be interesting to see how many of you, the 96% of you that are doing protection orders, be interesting to see the range of protection orders you're doing. And for those that type other, if you could put what those other are in the chat, that would be super helpful. Yeah, looks like we've got almost 75%. We'll just wait a second more. Anybody else want to jump in? Okay. So it looks like the 96% of you are doing domestic violence protection orders. Over half of you have experience with stalking and sexual assault protection orders, which is great. A few of you have done human trafficking protection orders, or one of you has done human trafficking protection orders. And in the chat, okay, so somebody were talking about harassment and threats not between family members, and some of you have got some experience with workplace sexual harassment and peace orders. Great. Excellent. Okay. So these are the 7 states that have human trafficking specific protection orders. There are 7, or actually 9. 7, they could be used for either labor or sex trafficking, and 2 additional states, Oklahoma and Maine, are sex trafficking only. Several states explicitly cover trafficking, usually sex, less often labor. So what I would say is, where the human trafficking is specifically listed as a crime within other forms of protection orders listed here: domestic violence, child abuse, anti-stalking, anti-harassment, or sexual assault protection orders. And the difference there is that by covering human trafficking in those orders, for that type of order, it's great. But if you're a labor trafficking victim and it's only in your domestic violence or sexual assault protection order, you may not be able to get a protection order in that state because you don't have a relationship or the sexual assault. So that's why it's kind of a bit of a puzzle, which is why we created these tools to help you figure out how to navigate based on the particular case. So child abuse protection orders in human trafficking, 3 states specifically have protection orders for, in Alabama, it's sexually abused child. In Utah, it's a child trafficked for sex or child labor trafficking. So it's either. And in Maine, it's sexual exploitation or dissemination of explicit materials or harassment. So generally, in many more states, help for human trafficking victims comes through stalking protection orders, harassment protection orders, these 2, which are particularly helpful for labor trafficking victims. And what's really interesting is, there are prosecutors we train with, and one of the prosecutors I talk to all the time says, like, when she was a domestic violence prosecutor, and we do trafficking trainings together too, and she says kind of the same thing with human traffickers and domestic violence predators, both of them, that there's like a triumvirate. There's 3 things that often go together: domestic violence, stalking, and witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. And so you really want to be looking for stalking, being able to detect stalking and stalking behaviors is really, really important when you're working with trafficking victims and trying to help them navigate options for protection orders. And so one of the things we should do, Abby, is we should we'll add to the webpage. We've done some very interesting trainings on stalking, working with Jen Landhaus at Equitas at Spark, that we'll put on the link to the page that have some tools we developed for judges on identifying stalking. I think that could be super useful to you as well, particularly if you're working with trafficking victims and you're trying to figure out how to get them a protection order in your state, if stalking may be the avenue for many of you. So and partially because they're the second one of the, there's 39 states that have specialized stalking statutes, and 6 additional states where stalking is part of the domestic violence protection order, 6 where they're together with a harassment protection order, and then 1 with sexual assault and 1 in workplace violence. Most states, 44 do. So of the 44 states that have one of these forms of stalking protection orders, 44 states don't have a relationship requirement. So that's super important in your labor trafficking cases, and it could be true in some sex trafficking cases as well, where the trafficker has never posed to be the boyfriend. They are essentially the pimp and making her sleep with other people. You could end up, you're going to have to think creatively about where they're going to fit in your state. If it's mostly domestic, you need to think beyond domestic violence. Okay, and in some states there can be, mostly in states where the only way to a stalking protection order is through the domestic violence one, is where you see relationship requirements. I get that right, Nupur?
Yeah.
Did all the research. I'm presenting. Okay, so in 19 states, there are specialized anti-harassment protection orders that cover harassment. These typically don't have relationship requirements. And an additional 30 states cover harassment, which is, again, another avenue in, like stalking, in the domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault, or workplace violence protection orders. In addition, we wanted to be sure you have the links, and these will be on the webpage for you so that you can get further information. So the stalking webinar I was just talking about is listed here. Another thing to really look at, we did a webinar with on predatory helpfulness, new research coming out of New York, I believe. I mean, it's being published in New York. I think it might be national. That looks at predatory helpfulness, which I'll show you a minute in the next slide, what that means or the kinds of ways of detecting it. But there's a commonality between domestic violence perpetrators and human traffickers that this social science research is finding when it comes to predatory helpfulness behaviors, which could, again, based on what they are, much like coercive control, could provide a basis, depending on your state and what criminal activities are occurring in relationship to what kind of behaviors that your protection orders can be based on, are covered in your state. So we want you to think carefully, especially when you're thinking with labor trafficking victims, that looking at stalking, looking at predatory helpfulness, and looking at coercive control, particularly in the domestic violence relationships as well. And these are 3 resources on those that I really commend you to look at. The coercive control, by the way, since I've got a group of family lawyers, I have to tell you, this chapter that was done by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges is great. It's super helpful in custody cases. So I highly commend you to take a look at the chapter. It's really well done and detailed. And it talks about the dangerousness of coercive control and how to talk to judges so that they take it seriously. It's a really, really good piece. So these are the questions that this is the predatory helpfulness screener that is designed for both domestic violence and human trafficking cases. And it's very, very helpful. We have built this into our trauma-informed interview tool that I'll be talking about in a little bit later in the session, but it gives you an idea of like how easy it is actually to screen for this kind of predatory helpfulness behavior. Yeah, I'll just leave it on the screen for a second so you have time to look at that. I tried to read it when I did this session with the, it just gets really long if I try to read out loud to you. But this is in the materials we're providing for you. Nipur, anything else I should mention about this now?
No, I think you're good here. And all the material, just reiterating that the materials will be on the family law communities of practice page. If you're not a member, then please reach out to me and we'll give you the password. But most of you would have the password to access the materials already.
Yeah. So when we talk about sexual assault protection orders, almost all states have protection orders for sexual assaults. And this usually includes sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual abuse, unlawful sexual contact without consent. 39 states have specialized sexual assault protection orders, and the remaining states have sexual assault as part of either a domestic violence or anti-harassment protection order. 42 states have no relationship requirement in the sexual assault protection order. And that gives you an overview. Some states a few states that have the relationship requirement, there may be other forms of sexual assault. Like for example, in Georgia, there's an adult sexual assault victims can get a stalking protection. Would be one way of kind of, again, getting around if you have to look creatively at what your state does offer. All states, all jurisdictions, 56, have domestic violence protection orders that you're all quite familiar with, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But this is where the child issue becomes important, particularly if you're talking about human trafficking happening within families, which I'll show you some of the data on in a few more slides. But there are 8 states that limit access to protection orders for children in some manner or another. As I showed you in Iowa, some states will allow it against dating partners, but not other family members. Most states, you can get a protection order against anybody that you're related to by blood or marriage. including in-laws, including all kinds of family members. And, you know, in this context, that's the best approach. And again, if you're talking about immigrant families and you're talking about labor trafficking, you often have situations where the perpetrator of domestic violence in the relationship is forcing his spouse or girlfriend or the mother of his children, maybe the stepchildren, to work for a family business that is run by his uncle or his cousin, or that he runs. I mean, there's all of those kinds of things. So you want to, again, these can be very broadly useful in the labor context, in addition to just looking at it from a domestic violence perspective. In states that do limit or not allow a child to get domestic violence protection order, a child victim of human trafficking, some of them have other options. And this give you some examples. You can get a protection order for sex trafficking, which is covered in Maine. Might have to go through stalking in New Hampshire, or the sexual abuse protection order in Iowa. It's kind of how what you can use these tools to figure out. Only 4 states have dating violence specific protection orders: Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, and Utah. 48 states, the dating violence is covered in the state protection order statute and requires a dating relationship that is described in the statute. That description of the dating relationship as it's described in your statute is covered in our big tables, right, Nipur?
Yes, all the definitions are there, and cannot emphasize enough, looking at the definition of the relationship that is asked of.
Great, thank you. So one of the reasons, I mean, this is the data I was talking about earlier. I don't know how many times I present on this slide, and it still shocks me that over 62.7% of sex trafficked children, one of their traffickers is a family member. And so we are seeing this in our family cases. It's there sometimes under the radar, and we're not noticing it. And it's really important to identify human trafficking when it's occurring, particularly in cases of immigrant families, or foreign-born children, because if a child is either sex or labor trafficked by a family member or anyone else, and you identify it before that child turns 18, and we have another whole tool on this we can present to you and give you, we have a whole webinar with the Department of Health and Human Services on this. So the Office on Trafficking in Person takes requests for assistance from children identified before they turn age 18 as potential victims of human trafficking. And they will do their own investigation. And if the child is determined to be a victim of labor or sex trafficking by HHS, that child will get something called a child eligibility letter. And that child eligibility letter gives that child access to full public benefits like refugees for life. They can get the letter when they're 18, and it's still good when they're 25. And so it may be that their immigration remedy is a T visa or a U visa that may take years, but during that time, they get, through the child eligibility letter, they get full access to public benefits and services. So it's really, really, really important to recognize when child trafficking is happening in families for immigrant children, and to think about both protection orders and OTIP referrals and immigrant, all of them. I said both. There's and immigration relief for those children. So does Department of Homeland Security, true or false, Department of Homeland Security recognizes that human trafficking can occur within domestic violence relationships? Just waiting until we're near the 75 mark.
Yep.
Okay. So 82% of you, so 82% said true. It is true. There's new both regulations and policies that recognize this. So this is for the 18% said no, this is fairly new information. So, and there's some really good work that has been done on this. The Department of Homeland Security has updated the involuntary servitude definition for purposes of T visas to include, be defined as follows. It's a condition of servitude induced by means of any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe or to fear that if that person did not enter into or continue in such condition or undertake the forced work, they or another person would suffer serious harm, physical injury, physical restraint, or legal coercion. And the serious harm definition includes things like reputational harm, emotional harm, physical, so it's quite broad. And they also recognize abusive legal process as part of it, including things like threats of deportation, threats to turn her into Child Protective Services or IRS, or all kinds of other abuse of the legal process. And the abuse of the legal process is defined as threatened use of law or legal process in either administrative, civil, or criminal in a manner for any purpose other than which the laws were designed in order to exert pressure on another person or cause the other person to take an action or refrain from taking an action. So we've probably seen this. What are some of, maybe you can type as I move forward in the chat, some of the examples of how you've seen this kind of thing occurring in your cases? And then lastly, and I think this is I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is a quote. This is pretty much a quote from the Department of Homeland Security. And it talks about how involuntary servitude can occur in domestic violence relationships. And it provides you a good roadmap for some of the kinds of things you would be looking for to detect human trafficking occurring in addition to domestic violence in a relationship that would make a domestic violence victim, let's say somebody in that long U visa line, eligible for a trafficking victim visa that comes with more access to public benefits and a quicker road to a green card, lawful permanent residency, work authorization, protection from deportation, and all of that. So they're talking about where the trafficker controls the victim's liberty, creating conditions of servitude, where the expectation is that the victim's life fulfills the trafficker's orders. Things like, round the clock availability for work, regardless of the victim's need to sleep, health at the time, without regard to their energy level, any of that it's constantly, that could qualify. They recognize that imposition of unlegal living requirements could contribute to that too, factually as well. Things like withholding food, unequal sleeping arrangements, etc. So it's a good definition that could help you identify more of these cases where trafficking is co-occurring with domestic violence. Extreme risk protection orders and elder use protection orders. So there are 18 states that have extreme risk protection orders, usually filed against people, those who are at risk of causing bodily harm to themselves or others by firearms. Specialized elder abuse protection orders are available in 14 states, and eligible victims in most of those states must be 60 to 65 years or older. I don't like reading those anymore because I'm way too close to those ages.
Yeah, some states also provide protection against financial abuse for elders. I just don't remember which on the top of my head, but they do.
And it's in the chart, right, Nicole?
Yes, it's all in the chart.
Okay, great. So from the work you've done with human trafficking victims, what kinds of protection orders that we've gone over today do you think might be the most useful to the human trafficking victims you've identified in your practice? And maybe you can just share some thoughts in the chat. Or unmute and speak if you'd like. Anybody?
It's quiet. I'm not seeing anything in chat either.
Okay. Anybody want to share? Trish?
Yeah, I don't mind sharing. So I struggle, like when working with trafficking victims, you know, we're like, I mean, obviously when there's a domestic violence like intersection, you know, that, you know, you're looking at multiple options, but you know, I think over the years, like working with the trafficking victims that I've worked with, like the decision was often not to pursue protective orders, which was sort of interesting. And I don't know if that's because I was dealing with cases that were more like criminal involved, but there was sometimes, again, the victims were sometimes hesitant to like want to go to civil court, which would give that trafficker more access to them. So that was sometimes a thought. Of course, here in South Carolina, like we you know, we don't have a sexual assault civil protective order. So that was sort of a missing piece. And so I think there was sort of looking at like, so if you know, you did have a relationship issue, like on the cases where I had relationships, like cohabitating or child in common, and you could have done it through a domestic violence protective order. Sometimes I had survivors who were, concerned about ones, again, same thing, like same normal things, like seeing the perpetrator, but also we've been seeing, especially when the victim had a child with their trafficker, it was sort of inviting the trafficker to sort of continue to do threatened abusive legal process to try to get custody or visitation rights around that. So we had some, it was really interesting. So we had like a lot of real tough conversations with clients about whether they wanted to walk into family court and give that trafficker more ideas or more avenues or more ways to sort of try to gain control over these children that they were often used as leverage. So that was, I mean, I'm kind of giving you a negative spin on this. And then of course, like for us, you know, also looking at, you know, if there was criminal interest in the case, like sometimes doing the civil stuff, I could see like our law enforcement partners were nervous about us tipping off the defendant that there was a trafficking theory in the case. Of course, like, and then of course, like I think that the biggest thing for me is always like there's such a dissonance between like the trafficking laws, both our federal and state, you know, recognize coercive control, they recognize threatened abusive legal process, you know, just like immigration, like we recognize lots of non-physical forms of abuse, both in the T visa context as well as in the trafficking context. Whereas in our family law and state law context, we only recognize physical forms of abuse. So it's just like interesting, like it doesn't always fit. And sometimes like going into court, I don't know, it's like a real complex analysis for us. But on the flip side, on the positive side, just like, you know, we've been working with like a lot of family court lawyers, you know, and although like our state laws don't recognize the coercive control, threatened abusive legal process, like on the books, like actually really making sure that family court lawyers and criminal attorneys were doing a much heavier screening for those types of things. So like when those facts were important, to sort of reframe a case as trafficking and like alerting the court that this is actually a trafficking case and not just a sexual assault or domestic violence case has been very helpful because like where I think sometimes the courts minimize domestic violence and don't often protect victims as much as you would like, you know, when they realize it's a trafficking situation, you know, for the first time, like they might be more willing to listen to, again, like the coercive control elements that are recognized in the trafficking statute. So I've been seeing family court lawyers using the words and themes from the federal frameworks to sort of present their cases so that there's a more holistic picture in going into civil protective orders or even, you know, more traditional custody cases involving traffickers. So I don't know, that's a little bit of a messed up thing, but it is, I think that we, you know, we sort of like using both statutes as sort of, because again, they sort of, they don't quite fit because the federal law, you know, trafficking sees everything as problematic, whereas our domestic and sexual violence statutes are so much more narrow. And then I just thinking back to the beginning, though, I do think like thank you for like mentioning the focus on stalking harassment. I think like, you know, years ago when Equitas like really started and Spark started to do the stalking harassment stuff, I think there was a real recognition, at least here in South Carolina, where we are, that all of us like system wide under identifying stalking and harassment. as independent crimes. And, you know, because I think we just sort of lump it in, you know, to this experience of domestic violence or this experience of trafficking. And I think like really using that training and using that screening has really helped us increase our recognition both on the criminal side and using and getting much more aggressive about using stalking harassment restraining orders has been really helpful, especially for trafficking victims who have sometimes more complex, less clear relationships with their perpetrators. So that's my long-winded meandering, but
super helpful. So Trisha, like what's interesting about that is I think the point you raised about screening and empowering the client to kind of think through these things. You know, you might sometimes we've done a lot of technical assistance recently around these issues where we're trying to both help them safety plan and then figure out, okay, making sure they know and you've identified what's available as in the protection order world. And in a recent TA we did, what we ended up doing is saying, okay, let's walk you through how to prepare so that when and if they're like he wants visitation with the kids or he tries, you know, something's going to happen, you're ready to go to take, because you're not initiating in the same way. And so thinking about that analysis and saying, okay, come back to me if these things happen, or if you're starting to get stuff on social media or whatever that's making you nervous and you feel you really do want to go to that step to get the protection order, you're then ready for it then instead of scrambling later.
And I think it's important, like, so whichever move the survivor wants to take, like making sure that there's a consistent story regarding trafficking. So if you know there are elements of domestic violence and sexual assault, stalking and harassment, but also trafficking, is at least crafting the pleadings or crafting the presentation of the case, even if it may not be safe to like identify and use the word trafficking, you know, in a particular, for whatever reason, is like making sure that there's sort of like really looking at those definitions of trafficking and incorporating like the factual underpinnings to those coercive things has been really helpful, because you never know sort of when that's going to become really critical. And like I said, we are seeing an uptick in cases where traffickers are really aggressively trying to get custody and visitation of children that they've had with their victims, you know, whether that's, you know, like sex trafficking, like prostitution rings, or more interfamilial trafficking. And so I think like being able to like prepare for that narrative and show that narrative will really help the court see that this is a person who should not, you know, should not have custody of children, and any vulnerabilities that the victim might be experiencing are caused by, directly related to the leverage and control created in that. Yeah, because we've seen a lot of cases where like impregnating their victims is a actually purposeful step in the manipulation and control factor. So that's been alarming, and we've seen it multiple times. Like it's not an uncommon fact pattern for us.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate it. Very helpful. And I'll get to a couple of things. I'm going to pick up a few more things in what Trish said in a few minutes. But the other thing that's great about protection orders is you can think creatively about, you have some ability, a lot more flexibility than you might have in a criminal case, for example, to think creatively about remedies. And we encourage you, for all immigrant survivors, including in these trafficking cases, to use the catch-all provisions of your protection order statutes to get, you know, to design something that will give the remedy that your client needs, again, against their specific trafficker. Anything's orderable as long as there's a nexus with victimization. And you want to be sure to address safety and housing, financial issues, custody and care of children, religious, cultural, immigration, community support needs. And then really, you know, one of the things the judges I train with encouraging me to tell all of you is don't hesitate to ask a judge to, you know, hold status hearings. Like if you're really concerned and you want the judge to stay kind of involved in the case, you can actually, there can be status hearings that promote offender compliance And they don't necessarily have to involve your client. You could come, your client doesn't have to come, you could be there on her behalf at this, but it's him reporting that he actually went to the classes and that he's doing whatever he's supposed to do to comply to the order. And then they need to include creative remedies that will help ensure that if there's immigration related abuse, they can stop it. We have a whole webinar on creative remedies and protection orders, actually 2 of them that Nupur, we should post on the link as well in case people want to see them. And we also have some chapter of our sexual assault and domestic violence manuals that talk about creative remedies that really help think outside of the box, beyond what's just written in your statutes. And that the other thing is, one of the things that you've heard me, if you've heard me train on protection orders before, is it's so important to think about, to not only get protection orders when in the cases where people are living together, or even in work situations where the problem is that when you're working with victims who are immigrants or in the process of filing for immigration relief, it's going to take 2 to 4 years or 5 years for them to get work authorization, and based on the immigration case. And so what's important, if you're a spouse of a US citizen, it might come within 3 to 6 months, but your longer cases could be, I think 39 months is the waiting period right now for U visas and bona fide determinations. SIJ children are having to wait 4 or 5 years to get lawful permanent residency. So during that time, protection orders that don't require that the parties separate, or that they not work together, or they not be in the same home together, could be a super important tool. And I don't know, how many of you, can you raise your hand? How many of you have gotten protection orders where the parties aren't planning on separating right now? Wonder if I get any hands. I'm sure I will, but maybe not. And to raise your hands, you have to go, what is it? The reactions feature. And then you can find the hand raise. Okay, I've got a couple, at least one. Okay. Well, they're available. I mean, maybe we'll do a separate thing on full contact, on no unlawful contact protection orders. Doing a lot of training for judges on this recently. Super important element to all of this. So are you currently using tools? Do you have tools that help you identify when domestic violence and sexual assault victims are also experiencing human trafficking? And this is your last poll for the day. Almost 50-50. Okay, let's share the results. It looks like a little over half of you do, and a little under half of you do not. So one of the things that those of you that do, if you've got tools you really like, we'd love to see if you're willing to share them with the group. That could be super helpful. I know these are I'll just ask that. Hold on 1 second. I saw a couple of it. So I'm looking at Dennis, I'm looking at your your note. The survivor not to seek protection order because they do not believe it will be effective, not really protect them from the trafficker. Especially when the trafficker doesn't know where the victim's located. That is true. That's one of the things you have to kind of think about. You don't have to disclose her location to get a protection order, but if they have to come to court, he may be able to follow her from there, unless you can do it remotely, which more people are. And you're right that there's more control in family court than criminal court. Great. Thank you for sharing. Okay, let me stop oh, I didn't share the results of the poll. Sorry about that. Did I? I forgot. Okay.
Yeah.
So, this is what I showed you about 50-50. And again, any of you who are using polls and would like to, screening tools and like to share them, that would be super helpful and we could share them with the group. We have a trauma-informed interview questionnaire that we've developed over the years for particularly U visa and U visa and VOSO petitions and family court cases. And these are aids that help both advocates and attorneys elicit in-depth information that they need for the affidavits in immigration cases, or for, as Tricia was talking about, the background, the information you need to litigate a family court case. We have these are the 3 tools. Recently, we've added, in the last year or two, we've added a whole series of cases. We worked with Spark to add questions about stalking. The predatory helpfulness tool that I showed you earlier has been built into this trauma-informed interview tool. And we worked with Mariosa Flesher at VIDA Legal Assistance and the Battered Women's Justice Project in Miami to build in a set of questions that will help you identify human trafficking happening within families. So our tool isn't a general tool that will identify all trafficking. It's particularly designed to identify trafficking occurring within families or in workplaces or in like relationships where sexual assault is also not relationships when sexual assault is co-occurring. So we're focusing on kind of identifying human trafficking co-occurring with other crimes. And we have that available for you on the website. Any questions that you would like to, while we're thinking, please, if you have any questions, just unmute yourself and ask. We're got about 2 minutes left to go to the session. And while you're thinking about that, we wanted to remind you, if you have a case, you can always contact us for technical assistance. We'll send you the link in the chat and by email to the webpage that we've created for this session that's along with your other COP materials. And we wanted to let you know that the next session is going to be a joint session. You want to talk about it, Nipur?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that most of you are used to having, attending our family law COPs on the last Tuesday for the of the month. In June, we have sort of switched it a little bit, and we'll be doing a joint session with the victim advocates on the 10th of June. We're not doing a session in July, so it would be nice if you could all make it to the June session, and then we'll reconvene in August.
Exactly. And we're working on the topic choice for that, but we'll be getting that out to you momentarily. We've got 2 ideas and we're trying to figure out if we can pull one together fast enough. So we'll see. It should be an exciting topic, and I really appreciate your time and attention today and your participation in the community of practice. Thank you for all being here, and we hope you found it useful. Have a great week, and I hope you all had a good holiday break.